Viktor Frankl was an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist, and a Holocaust survivor. After surviving such terrors, he wrote one of his most popular books, Man's Search for Meaning, and developed the psychological therapeutic doctrine called logotherapy, whereby logos in Greek means meaning, therefore meaning therapy. He asked the question, what drives humanity? His conclusion was this: the will to meaning. It was the desire for meaning that made people continue on living. This view would contradict other psychoanalytic viewpoints at the time. For example, Freud believed in the will to pleasure, and Adler believed in the will to power. Man's search for meaning for Frankl was man's primary motivation in his life, and certainly not something of a secondary rationalization of instinctual drives, as Freud would call it. As I quote, "There are some authors who contend that meanings and values are nothing but defense mechanisms, reaction formations, and sublimations. But as for myself, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defense mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live and even to die for the sake of his ideals and values." End quote. From his experiences in the Holocaust, Frankl saw something empirical at its most extreme that would detonate psychological fatalism. This was all part of what Frankl called the collective neurosis, which is that of nihilism, with the belief that being itself has no meaning. Frankl saw that the fatalistic conditioning of science on mankind would only make the nihilistic neurotic believe themselves as a pawn and victim of outer and inner influences and circumstances, thus denying man's freedom and making the existential vacuum ever so bigger. I quote, "This neurotic fatalism is fostered and strengthened by a psychological therapy which denies that man is free." End quote. What Frankl saw beyond the conceptions of determinism and scientific fatalism was that, on a foundational level, man's ability to withstand conditions is a definition of freedom. This understanding did not neglect the reality of man's deterministic nature, but saw, with insight from the Holocaust, that man is capable of defying and braving the worst conditions conceivable, even those with the sole intent to destroy. What he saw in the concentration camps was that people who knew there was a task waiting for them to fulfill were most apt to survive. Hence the Nietzschean quote, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." Because of this, Frankl saw that for a good mental health, a tension needs to be of existence. That tension would most precisely be, I quote, "the gap between what one is and what one should become." He saw that it was extremely dangerous to presuppose the need for equilibrium or a tensionless state, because what man really needs is, I quote, "not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task." End quote. Something that Frankl saw as being the widespread phenomenon of the 20th century and thus causing a loss of meaning was what he called the existential vacuum. He said that it was the result of two fundamental occurrences: one, the loss of tradition, and two, loss of animal instinct. The fact that man has to make a choice puts the prospect of paradise and security at a halt. I quote, "No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism." End quote. Another quote, he says, "The existential vacuum manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom. Now we can understand Schopenhauer when he said that mankind was apparently doomed to vacillate eternally between the two extremes of distress and boredom." End quote. Depression, aggression, and addiction. This is what you could call the mass neurotic triad of the people. But this is what Frankl saw as a result of the existential vacuum of the 20th century. All three of these have nothing but skyrocketed since the appearance of the existential vacuum. His attack against Adlerian and Freudian psychoanalysis in relation to the will to power and will to pleasure is based on the fact that the existential vacuum can mask itself behind these different strivings of the will. I quote, "There are various masks and guises under which the existential vacuum appears. Sometimes the frustrated will to meaning is vicariously compensated for by a will to power, including the most primitive form of the will to power, the will to money. In other cases, the place of frustrated will to meaning is taken by the will to pleasure. This is why existential frustration often eventuates to sexual compensation. We can observe in such cases that the sexual libido becomes rampant in the existential vacuum.